show. Right, just before I start, I have got one apology to make for last week. When I talked about 2 English churches which I knew had moved, and I talked about Perranporth, and I said Stonegrave. I didn't mean Stonegrave, I meant the next church along the road, Sproxton. Anyhow, let us begin. So this week, I thought that what I would do was a little bit of a road trip, going through some of the Stave churches that we actually saw in 2014 and on some of our other visits in Norway. And so I'm going to start with, check. Yeah, I'm gonna sort of follow roughly a route that we followed in 2014. So I'm going to start at Hoppestad. And this is one where it features not only in Norway, but there is a replica in Minnesota, which was built about 25 years ago. But Hoppestad, I just love the copper beech, which is growing in the churchyard. And that actually is an indication of a very, very mild microclimate there. This church was built in just after 1130 and is, together with Ernest, which we looked at last week, the oldest Stave church in existence. During its long life, it has suffered both periods of neglect and quite a revival. It was derelict in 1880, but in 1881, the architect Peter Andreas Blix offered his services free of charge to restore the Stave church. And here I've actually just got some of the dendrochronology dates which have been taken recently on Hoppestad. And the thing which really fascinates me is up here on the north wall of the chancel, we have got some planks which have been dated. The earliest is 965. And it's quite clear that the church that we're seeing here now, which they think was built on timbers which were felled in the winter of 1131 to 32, that actually you have got at least one earlier church on this site with timbers having been reused from it. But here we are. This is a pen and ink drawing of Hoppestad Church as it was at about the time that Peter Blix offered to restore it. It had just been sold to the Society for Preservation of Ancient Norwegian Monuments, but their purchase only included the medieval part of the church, and post-Reformation additions and the furnishings were demolished and materials sold. Peter Blix started to work on the church, and here we've actually got a photograph during his restoration work. This photograph was taken about 1885, where he's already put fresh shingles, and these incidentally were oak shingles rather than pine shingles. Somebody asked me last week what the building materials were, and I said almost entirely pine. The oak shingles were replacing what had been oak shingles on the original church. And here you can see him at the work in the restoration, where the roofline is being enhanced somewhat. Those are just some of Peter's drawing, survey drawings at the start of his restoration work. And here, 130 years later, they're doing another restoration, replacing many, almost all the roof shingles. It now has a very, very ornate roof with wonderful dragons, although at the time that Blix started work, there were no dragons and there was no central tower there either. One of the doors, the south door at the moment, is actually giving them quite a bit of concern because of this appearance of white on the woodwork. Whoopsie, I didn't mean to jump quite that far. Yeah, and here we are. Around Hopperstadt, you have got a very substantial ambulatory, and just look at this sort of the size of the stave there on the corner of the ambulatory. This gave an area for covered processions, which would start inside the church, go out, go right round the church in the ambulatory, and then back into the church. And here you can see one of the priest's doors, and just see how high that door actually is, which enabled people to leave the church while carrying things on their shoulders. We'll come to that a little bit later. Wonderful west portal, and the detail of the carving here. Unfortunately, with sort of 800 years of tarring, the detail of the carving is not as good as it used to be. But let's go inside. And here, the chancel screen itself, this is the only surviving early medieval chancel screen in Norway, dates from just after 1200. Here, the altar itself was put back in by Blix during his restoration, but the altarpiece behind dates from 1621. And then let's just have a look up into the roof. And you can see you've only got a few small windows actually to bring any light into the building. Here looking up, and you get an incredible feeling of height within these buildings, as you've got the central room is absolutely towering up above you, held on these tall staves. But let's have a little bit more of a look at the canopy over the side altar on the north side of the nave. This, the woodwork has been dated to about 1210, but they think that the painting inside may be slightly later. But just look at the quality of the carving on the woodwork. So you've got the face of Christ, which was up at the top, and you have got a wonderful, I mean, words fail me. And here we are looking up inside the canopy. And I've got here a better detail of the interior paintings that you've got inside there. Now, before the church was sold and restored, this is a painting which was made in 1866, and it gives a feel for what the church may look like then. There was actually 3 levels of galleries in the church, which were reached by stairs. I'm talking about the height that you've got there. You could get quite a lot of people up vertically within the church. And you've got a lot of painting and post-Reformation decor. Now, Blix, when he started the restoration work, asked for the post-Reformation paintwork to be removed, but they were a little bit too enthusiastic, and a lot of the pre-Reformation paintwork, also almost all of it, went as well. But here, on one of the staves, there's actually a it's interpreted as being Peter and Paul on the stave there. And there's some other distemper painting which still survives within the church. There's actually about 19 of the stave churches have actually been found to have remains of this sort of distemper painting inside. But when we come out of the church, here is the site of the stave church, but just a kilometre away, there is a stone medieval church, which is only a few years younger than Hoppestadt Stave Church. And there is the modern church, which actually replaced both of the old churches. Here we are actually now up at the old stone church, which Peter Blix bought himself. That's Catherine standing outside. And you can see how close you actually are to the stave church. There's Hoppestadt Stave Church in the distance. But the stone church has got some wonderful soapstone carvings above the doors, soapstone decoration there. Peter Blix had a little bit of a fancy here with some of the wooden decorations which were part of his rework in 1890. And when he died, he is actually buried there inside the church, which he owned at the time. But as we moved on from Hoppestadt, we spent the night just outside at a ferry terminal called Vangnes, which is about 20 kilometers north. And just outside there, there is this incredible statue of Fridtjof, which was a gift to the Norwegian people by the Kaiser Wilhelm II. And just look at the size of the statue compared with the people. This is a view of the statue before it was transported to Norway when it was set up in Berlin. The following day, we had a number of ferry trips. That's our car there in the foreground. We're on the ferry which was going across to Ørnes. One of the things which I had in my mind at the time that we were doing this journey was, would it be a good opportunity for a field trip for the churches class? Now, unfortunately, this ferry, which is the only way of getting to Ørnes, will not take a full-sized coach. You know, sort of a 20-seater, yes, but larger than that, no. Anyhow, the next church that we got to was Kaupanger, which was only 10 years or so younger than Hoppestadt. And this one here has still got 22 staves inside supporting the structure. It's the largest number of staves in any of the Norwegian stave churches. We know that there were two previous churches on this site. The previous one was the current church, was actually partially burnt down as a consequence of the farmers' revolt in 1183. But it's still an active church, and you can see the graveyard around. As we come inside, one of the notable things about this stave church is the staves themselves all have an oval profile. They're not circular. The church itself was actually largely rebuilt after archaeological investigations in the 1960s. But as with so many of these stave churches, you have an incredible sense of height, even though the ceiling here is now actually concealing the topmost bit of the roof. In the chancel, they've restored the chancel to how it would have been in about 1600. Whoopsie, wrong way. Well, what I love here is the chancel arch, where the arch there, which is above the arch there, is actually thought to have been reused from one of the two earlier stave churches, which they know was actually on the site. And here in the chancel itself, they haven't put a screen across at the top of the stave. So actually, you've got an incredible sense of height, even there in the chancel. But one of the fascinating things here is 60 a wall painting from just after 1600, which has got musical notation. And here you can see there was a window inserted there, which has been replaced about 1820. So what you've actually got here is musical notation in the form of neumes, which was the medieval way of writing. And then we left Kaupanger, and the next place we're stopping at on our trip today is Undredal. We didn't actually get to Undredal in that sequence then, because Undredal is not easy to reach. In fact, the first road didn't reach Undredal until 30 years ago. And I remember driving through the tunnel the year after it was built. This church here, which is dedicated to St. Nicholas, is thought to be the smallest church in Scandinavia. It now is able to hold a congregation of just 40. One of the roof beams has a carving on it, which indicates that it was built in 1147, and dendrochronology is consistent with that. But the first written reference to this church is in a letter dating back in 1321, written by Bishop Audfinn of Björgvin, that's Bergen, naming one Paul Bårdsson, vicar of Undru Capella, the Undredal Chapel. And in 1348, there is a diploma from Avignon, which mentions that Pope Clemens VI made Canon Odd Ogmusson curate of St. Nikolai's Chapel in Undredal. There's documentary evidence in 1665 which says that there was a covered walkway all the way around the outside of the church, but there is no trace of that today. It's a very simple stave church. There are just 4 staves from the original structure there. Inside, you can see that one begins to appreciate that the interior has been much modified over time, including around 1850, when the building was extended to the west, adding in the bell tower and the porch. And inside, quite a lot of the paneling was actually recovered from another stave church in nearby Nerøy, which had been demolished as a result of the Churches Act in 1831, which required churches to be sufficiently large to seat 30% of the population. So Nerøy got a new church, and Undredal used the reused pieces from Nerøy Church to extend their own. It's got this incredible wooden chandelier from from Bavaria, which is dated about 1650. And a wonderful painted ceiling. And in the back corner of the church, there is this bell here, which is an English cast bell from about 1500. There are two other much later bells actually hanging up in the tower. But at the end of every service, that bell is always rung 9 times to indicate the end of the service. Now, we moved on. After we had visited Ernest that day, our next port of call was Borgund, which is one of the best known of the Norwegian stave churches. And here in the plan of Borgund, you can see how you have got this external ambulatory or covered ambulatory all the way round the church. Here we have a drawing of what it was like in 1839. And now I've got a photograph of 1910, where you had got the new church which had been built to replace the old one, which was too small. But you've still got the old stave church in the background. That 1910 church, well, that church which was photographed in 1910 has since disappeared. It's been demolished. There is instead a visitor centre for people who come here. But that there is how we saw the church in 2014 when we visited. The church, the main staves inside have been dated to 1180 to 1181. And they think that the ambulatory was actually put on about 20 years later, just after 1200, from the dendrochronology on the outside there. One of the wonders of Borgund, again, is the carvings on the portals. And here we're looking at the west portal. That's the outside, but I just love the door itself and the bolt that there is on the inside. Like Hopperstadt, Borgund, unfortunately, is a dead church. It is owned by the state rather than still being used as a living church. But most of the stave churches actually are still in everyday use, just as the previous 2 that we had looked at. Here we are looking up into the roof at Borgund, and again you can see how very little light you actually got, because those were the only medieval windows into the church. Another view up into the roof. And good lighting actually reveals up in the corner here some traces of decorative distemper painting from about 1600. One of the mastheads, which you can see high up with the lovely face there. And the chancel, it's a medieval altar, medieval stone altar, but the altarpiece behind and the chasuble both date from just after 1600. And here in the church, there's sort of a side window which enables people from the ambulatory to be able to look in to the chancel itself. And so we move on to our next church, Lom, which was built another 20 years or sorry, Lom was built just before Burgund. It's been significantly extended since it was originally built. And you can see how much of the construction now you have got the horizontal log construction. When we arrived there was a wedding was in progress, which actually meant on that day we couldn't get inside, but we had some wonderful views of amazing national costumes. In Norway, every individual part of the country has its own pattern. So you can tell where somebody has come from by the nature, by the nature of the costume that they're wearing. When one does get inside, and this unfortunately was not one of my photographs, but one of the things which they found 1973, when they were doing some investigations in the work, they found this 1225 manuscript under the floor, and this is a hymn to St. Thomas a Becket. And I had to include this photo, which was from a book which my mother treasured, which is actually a view from the roof of Lom, which the average visitor will never see. So from Lom, we move on to Ringebu. And when we arrived at Ringebu in 2014, it was all in scaffold because they were redoing the roof. Well, we go inside, and once again, just note the amazing sense of height that you have within the building. But what I want to focus on particularly is this crucifix there, which is hanging at the east end of the nave as one moves into the chancel. Note also all the decorative painting here, which actually dates from the 17th century. When you turn round and look the other way, you've actually got a second crucifix there hanging above the west door. Now, these two crucifixes, I'm seeing them here before restoration and after restoration in just after the turn of this century, 2001 to 2003. They did a lot of work on them. Now, this one here, which is the crucifix which is hanging above the west door, has been dated to about 1260. Whereas this one here, which is hanging at the east end of the nave, has been dated at about 1340, just prior to the Black Death. And they did a lot of examination of these crucifixes during the restoration work. And this one here, this one here, they have restored to how they think it looked in the early medieval time, but the other one here, they've actually preserved rather than restored. But you can see here how during the restoration, they have removed secondary painting from the face of Christ there, which was put in the 18th century, as they were able to deduce from the work which they had done. And you've also got here, they have uncovered, restored the evangelists. There were 4 evangelists on the 4 corners of the crucifix there. And here we've actually got digital reconstructions, but without the evangelists' symbols on the four corners of the crosses, but digital reconstructions which were made just a couple of years ago of how they think that those crucifixes would have been coloured and looked at about 1400. Now we moved on to Lowman Stave Church, and the day that we got there, it was absolutely raining cats and dogs. There's a porch here, and this is a result of the Church Act of 1830. Sorry, of the aftermath of the Gruer Stave Church fire, when the law was passed which said that all doors must open outwards. And so what they actually did was to move the portals because the Stave Church doors opened inwards, and created a porch so that there was an inner door there which opens outwards. And here we just got some of the lovely woodwork. Down below the door, the archway, you've now got the new door which opens outwards, but you've still got some of the wonderful work from inside. But one of the treasures of this church is in the chancel, where you've got a reproduction now of a 13th century tapestry, which was found inside the church. It was being used as a draft excluder. This, the original of this tapestry that you can see here, is now in the National Museum of Art, Architecture and Design in Oslo. But Catherine, with her particular interest in textiles, absolutely loved seeing that there. One of the other things that you've got, you've now got a modern font here in wood with a brass and a brass top and then a pewter basin, but it's replacing, you've got there the soapstone base of the old medieval font. But now we move on to what I think is one of my favourite stave churches. This is one which was lost and then found. The first reference to the church, the first written reference to the church, comes from 1327. And we now know that the church, the original Stave church, was a lot smaller than it is now. But at the time of the Black Death, the entire community was wiped out, and the church was lost for about 200 years. And there was, it was about 1550, there was somebody who was out hunting, and he fired an arrow and into the forest, and was rather startled to hear a bell clanging in the belfry there, which he had hit. And here, looking from the other side, you can see that there is the chancel, the present day position of the chancel of the church. You've got the belfry there. One of the treasures of this church is the west door. And here we're just looking at the ambulatory, which goes all the way around the church. And you've got the west door there with most wonderful carvings. This is one of the few stave churches actually where they still do not have a door which opens outwards, but this door is still hung so that it hangs inwards. Here, there's a drawing which dates from 1853 of the west portal, and it really does show up the incredible detail of the carving that you've got. And the door itself has got some lovely Romanesque ironwork on there. But you come inside, and here we are at the west end. We are in the area here at the west end. You can actually just see one of the four inner staves of the original Stave church. But the east end here is a lot newer. But it has got some wonderful treasures. There's a wealth of pre-Reformation, pre-Black Death survivals in the church. And we will go inside a little bit more and see some of them. Now, the first is the font. Soapstone font. And remember what we saw in Lomond Stave Church, the base of the font. And this one here has still got its 13th, 14th century paintwork on it. The wooden cover, the font itself, they think dates from about 1100, which is earlier than the construction of the church itself. The font cover has been dated at just after 1200, and you used a wooden font cover there as much as insulation to prevent the water in the font from freezing during the winter. Then as you move a little bit further in, you have got this absolutely glorious Madonna. This is dated about 1230, just after the Anglo-Norse treaty, and this is English work. In the 1980s, it was decreed that it was far too precious an item to actually live in the church, and it was moved to the Historical Museum in Oslo. A replica was made in 1990, and here's the replica. There is the original photographed in Oslo, but now, due to significant local pressure, the original is back in the church, and it is the replica which is in the museum in Oslo. And then let's have a look at the altarpiece. You've got this medieval altarpiece, which unfortunately was overpainted with rosemarling in 1760. And you have got this wonderful early medieval crucifix, which again has been overpainted. But the altarpiece was actually once a shrine for the Madonna. But actually, just before I move on, observe on the wall there, what you've actually got is a little figurine which originally was on the foot of the crucifix. Now, about 20 years ago, they actually did a lot of restoration work on the crucifix. And here, I've got a photograph of it during the restoration work. And before anybody asks me what wood the crucifix was made of, this one was made of spruce. And here you've got some details of how the restoration work has progressed. But I want to go back to the form of the church. At the west end, you have got where the original staves were. So this west end, the nave of the church, is actually the oldest part. Then in the 1600s, the transepts were added and the chancel was moved. And so these staves in the chancel are actually the same age as the staves for the nave, but they are not in their original position. Up above the chancel arch, there are a number of peg holes in the woodwork. And those peg holes were originally used to support the crucifix. And I've actually got here now a drawing which shows what the church would have been like when it was first built. And the chancel was moved in the 1600s when they put the transept in. So here we are. I'm now looking at the Madonna. This was from an exhibition in 1973, where you've actually got the Madonna has been placed inside the altarpiece, and you have got this wonderful representation of the church itself, a model of the church, sitting on top of the tabernacle for the Madonna. And you can see here how the tabernacle sometimes would have been closed or partially opened or fully opened. There are 17 such Madonna tabernacles preserved in Scandinavia, or fragments of them. They're dating, the earliest dates from about 1100, and the most recent, the time of the Black Death. In Norway, 2 of these tabernacles have been remodeled and reused as Lutheran altarpieces. One here in Hedalen Stave Church and another in the nearby Reinli Stave Church. So here there's actually a reconstruction of what they think the colouring of the tabernacle may have been like. And during some recent work, they've looked at the indentations scratched on the wings of the tabernacle there, which has enabled them to interpret what the scenes actually were there. So the scratch marks there, which were actually to outline silver foil, which was being used as part of the decorative work. So you've got the Annunciation up here, and then you've got the Visitation down there, and you've got the Adoration of the Magi. And on the other side, you have actually got the announcement to the shepherds, and you've got the Nativity there, and then finally the presentation in the temple. But still in the church, there is the top of the tabernacle, and one other absolutely wonderful relic. You've got the litter there, which was used to carry the reliquary that you can see up there in procession around the church. And this reliquary is absolutely wonderful. It's one of 5 such reliquaries remaining in Norway, but this is the only one which is actually still within its own church. There were other things here. You've got a medieval pax there. There's a foot from a crucifix, and here you have got a thurible which dates from 1220, and it is enameled Limoges ware. Remember the Anglo-Norse Treaty of 1217? And here a bit more detail of the reliquary. And down here, you've actually got a scene of the martyrdom of Thomas à Becket. And the local area, the flag for Sur Odal commune is actually based on the reliquary. So just down the road, Hedalen was there, and then Rhineley, Stave Church. We arrived there on a Sunday morning, and we took a few photographs outside, and then we went in and observe up here. You've got the organist sitting in his gallery up above in a loft above the altar, but the altarpiece itself, this is the other tabernacle, which dates from about the same time as the Hedalen tabernacle. This one was dismembered in the 1880s and converted into the altarpiece that you see there. And various scenes were painted, some in 1890 and some in the 1920s. But there was a service about to take place there. And this here, it was a baptism. The normal church that they use is actually down below this church today. There's sort of a tin tabernacle, but for special occasions, they still use the old Stave church. And now we move on to Torpo, which is a Stave church which very nearly didn't survive. It was half demolished when I think it was Hans-Peter Blix arrived on the scene and said, "Stop! I'm going to buy it. I will keep it, keep it, keep it." Here you can actually see the new church and all that remains of the old Torpo Stave church. It's got some wonderful paintings inside. So here we come in. And again, just note the sense of height that you have got in, looking up towards the west. But this actually is what you see when you come in through the west door, where you have got this incredible baldacchino. And this is distemper painting from about 1250. This is the best preserved of the distemper painting in any of the Stave churches. And it gives a very good impression of quite how the interior of Stave churches must have looked. Here I've got a detail from the story of St. Margaret, which is actually on, not on this side, but it's on the other side. And round the edges, Torpo allowed people to go to the wall because there's a bench pretty well all the way around. You've got two wonderful old chests, the money chest there and a vestment chest there. But remember, Catherine, and watch where you tread. Well, here you've got an interesting floor piscina. And also, there is the outline of a coffin. There's a priest buried underneath. So we move on our road trip and we come to Rollag, which is about 1250. And here, one of the things to see when you're at the church is actually just outside the church wall. There is this huge rock full of snakes, the so-called Ormstein. And it is thought that it was the presence of the Ormstein which determined that they built Rollag Church where they did. But here I'm now looking at the Christian churchyard as opposed to the site of the pre-Christian burials. And one of the stunning things that you've got in the churchyard there is this early stone cross, which is thought to date from about 850, and it is Irish, probably. We go inside. And just note this wall painting here and also the crucifix up above the chancel. That plate there was taken down, the epitaph there was, which had been painted in 1653, was taken down in 2003 for some conservation work, and they found that there was this fall of man on the back of the 1653 epitaph. It was also, the epitaph was also covering the beam at the top of the chancel, which also had some early distemper painting. And very recently, they've been doing some infrared photography in the church. And up in the ceiling, you can see in the infrared photography the face of a man there. And this here is actually from one of the chairs in the chancel. Again, the infrared photography has shown that there is something underneath the existing decoration. And here I've just got a picture of the crucifix after they had done some restoration work on it in 2005, and a digital reconstruction of what they think the crucifix actually looked like in the early medieval period. Outside, there's also quite a bit of decoration. It's not just a question of look where you tread, you need to look up into the sky as well, because even the eaves in the church there have got some wonderful painting from about 1650. Well, we're carrying on our road trip, and we come to Flesburg. And this one, this Stave church is notable because it's the earliest known painting of a Stave church. This painting dates from 1701. Just compare, the church as painted is only about half the size of what it is today. But one of the features of the church here is the church wall, where you've got these stone slabs, and every so often you have got a metal ring set in the stone wall for tethering horses. And inside there's even a tethering post with the name of the owner of the post. Going inside the church, you have got a quite dramatically painted west portal. I love the lions, I suppose, that you have got inside there. Inside, these nave walls at the west end are still from the original church. And after we had visited here, this is actually some restoration work which was only done 2 years ago. They have found quite significant traces of much, much earlier medieval painting underneath the distemper, which is flaking off the walls there. Look to the east end and you can see how the construction is entirely log construction, as opposed to the much older Stave construction when they extended the church. And now we're getting to the last of the churches in our road trip, Roldal. And here, this is a place where time stood still. It's said that this crucifix here was a miracle worker. On St. John's Eve, the crucifix would weep. and the tears from the crucifix would be able to cure all sorts of ailments. Now, there was, it's about, it was in the 1840s, pilgrims were still going here on St. John's Eve, and the local church authorities were worried about these reports of odd happenings in the church. And the then vicar said, but nothing happens. You come here on St. John's Eve. The problem was he didn't say that they were still working to the old calendar. And so the superintendent came and didn't see anything untoward happening. And then a fortnight later heard that there had been yet another of these events. So the church was rebuilt. But inside the church, you have still got, here you have got a soapstone font, which has been dated to about 1200. You've got an altar frontal. This is a painted wooden altar frontal from 1340. And here a close-up of the miraculous crucifix, which has been dated to about 1250. Here, this is the late 14th century altar frontal, which was originally in Roald Dahl. This is the Harrowing of Hell. Sadly, this is no longer in the church, but it is now in a museum in Bergen. But just to finish off with, I thought that we should have a look at a few places which are not quite what they seem. First of all, Jorengård, where there is a medieval farm and a modern stave church, which was built for the filming of Kristin Lavransdatter. And this church was actually burnt down as part of the filming. But a replica of what was burnt down was then built in 1999, and this is actually now a consecrated and working church. And now halfway down Sonjefjord is the town of Balestrand, which is home to one of the most unlikely churches in Norway, because this is an Anglican church. The Church of St. Olaf is part of the Diocese of Europe, which was built in the style of a stave church in 1897. In memory of one Margaret Sophie Green Kvikner, who was a vicar's daughter from Yorkshire. And it was said that she was never felt at ease with the Lutheran rituals in Norwegian churches. And on her deathbed, her husband promised to build an Anglican church in her memory. And that there is Sophie. And recently, this church provided inspiration for the designers of Disney's Frozen. But I think we have got the most remarkable story here of a traveling stave church. This is a stave church in Wisconsin in 2012, and a commemorative plate in Chicago, which was where this church was first built in 1893 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World. The stave church was actually built in parts in Orkla, just outside Trondheim in Norway, was erected in Chicago. After the exposition, it was bought by the Wrigley family of Wrigley's chewing gum fame, and then they sold it on to a Norwegian American called Isaac Dahler, who moved it to his summer retreat in the Blue Mounds. And then this turned into a sort of a Norwegian center. but it closed in 2012 and was then shipped all the way back to Norway. So this must be the most traveled stave church in the world. It's been now on 5 different sites. It's traveled about 12,000 miles. And here we can see it being deconstructed in Wisconsin. These carvings here were actually made by this guy's grandfather. Here, the church is now being re-erected just outside Trondheim. And the day when they rededicated this once again moved church back in Orkla, where it had originally been made. And that, I think, brings me to the end of this road trip.
Well done,
Fantastic.
thank you.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, very good.
Was there any heating in any of these churches?
Oh, no. No heating.
Any what, she said?
How did they manage in the middle of winter?
Well, in Norway, they have a saying, there is no such thing as bad weather, only bad clothing.
Yeah.
Wrapped up warmly in winter.
Mike, the fact that so many statues have survived, when the Reformation came to Norway, did they not destroy the medieval statues as they did in England?
There was far less destruction, although there was nonetheless quite a bit of destruction in Norway. But that stave church in Hedal, where you have got the crucifix and the reliquary and the tabernacle for the Madonna, they survived the Reformation because the church wasn't known about at the time of the Reformation. The community had been lost because of the Black Death. And it was only about 40 years after the Reformation that the church was rediscovered.
I think though, sorry.
Right, no, go on.
I think there was also a certain amount of local bloody-mindedness, which you saw actually at Hedal when they took the Madonna to Oslo.
Oh,
The locals insisted on it being brought back. And a similar sort of, the soul of the place is in these statues. We won't let them go.
Mike, I was just wondering whether you knew who founded the bell at Underdal.
No, we don't know who founded the bell, unfortunately, but it is quite an early English medieval casting.
Whitechapel.
Could be.
Who knows?
Were you hinting at a trip?
Sorry, David, I didn't catch that.
Were you hinting at a trip to Norway?
Well, I was thinking of, oh help, we've got a bad echo from somewhere.
Yeah.
I had been thinking in terms of a road trip as a field trip for the class, but quite honestly, the practicalities of being able to get to see the best of the stave churches in a group of more than about 20 simply isn't on. And the sort of accommodation that you're able to get, at times, it really is quite primitive. The night that we stayed at the ferry terminal at Vangsnes, that was a small bed and breakfast. It could sleep 12 people maximum, and it really was very primitive.
So a small group with lots of clothes and a tent.
Yes. But we have a Viking tent that you could use.
I mean, I think actually most of the accommodation we used was hostels, and they are, even by youth hostel standards, pretty primitive.
I noticed on some of the, or quite a lot of the decorations in the churches, they use a lot of green, red and green, where I would expect normally to see blue. Was there a reason for that?
Those were the locally available pigments, basically.
Copper compounds.
Copper and iron.
Green and red.
I mean, blue pigments in medieval times were generally very, very expensive.
Yes.
But they've got records in Hopperstadt of the repainting of the church in 1653, which was paid for by the parishioners.
Yeah.
So what sort of congregations do they get to these churches now? I mean, are they well supported?
Most of these churches are actually in pretty small communities. But in terms of the proportion of the community which attends, you know, you may be talking at Urnes, it's about 30% of the local population are actually the local worshippers.
It's probably about the same as here.
Oh, quite possibly higher.
Much higher.
And do they get state aid to run the churches?
The church in Norway has been disestablished until about 10 years ago. Yes, all priests were actually civil servants and were paid for by the state. Now the congregations actually have to support their priests. And it is, it's meant that in some places, churches have withered away because the congregations simply are not there. In other places, it really has brought new life. The church service, the only church service that we've actually been to in a Stave church was at Rhineley, where there was that baptism. And during the service, there were a few hymns, and the organist up above the altar, you could hear him singing, and you could hear it was a woman priest, and she was singing, and we were right at the back of the congregation, and the two of us were singing. And at the end of the service, the priest said to us, "You must be English, because it's only the English who know how to sing."
I wonder what the relative cost was. I wonder what the relative cost was of building in stone and in wood, because you had a wooden church and a stone church very close in time. And I wondered why they stuck with wood for so many years beyond the period where stone had long taken over in the UK.
Well, stone was a much more expensive material to work with than wood. That stone church was actually built originally as a private chapel for the landowner there, the local thane, who was one of the most important nobles in Norway at the time.
So they were very small, poor communities, weren't they?
Small communities, yes, not necessarily poor. I mean, if you look at the amount of riches which were imported from Limoges in the immediate aftermath of the Anglo-Norse Treaty, there was quite a lot of wealth there.
Can't remember whether you told me what the connection between an English-Norwegian treaty and Limoges was.
At the time of the Anglo-Norse Treaty,
Yes.
1217,
Who was the king?
which was the first free trade agreement ever in the world, which removed import taxes on luxury goods between Norway and England, and also provided for free movement of labour between Norway and England. Remember, at that stage, the Kingdom of England included quite a bit of France, including Limoges.
Sorry.
And suddenly, the result of the Anglo-Norse Treaty was that Limoges ware could travel to Norway free of tax.
Sorry, I remember now. You did say.
17. Best free trade treaty in the world, he said.
Yeah.
And the simplest.
I remember him saying, couldn't remember the name.
Well, I think next week we're back to Catherine.
Yep, on pilgrimage to Trondheim from Oslo. So tracing 2 pilgrimage routes.
So this month has effectively been our Norway season, breaking COVID travel restrictions and braving Norwegian weather.
I think we've got the Norwegian weather.
Don't you believe it, Moira? I remember nights in Norway when it was dropping to -40.
Oh, right. Oh, it feels like that here at the moment. Yeah.
2 years ago, about this time of year, we were up in the north, -32 during the day.
I caused consternation to some of the people in the party because I was still wearing sandals without socks.
Anyhow.
Right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.